And there it is. Click.
There you go.
And we're live. It is Sunday, April 11th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. The great suspense of the day was whether Kate was going to make it back in time from Cape Cod to do the show, or whether I was going to have to figure out who the mystery guest was without her, which wouldn't have been that hard, given who the mystery guest turns out to be. Kate has made it. About an hour ago, she texted me a picture of herself and Nina, which was a sure sign that she was home. And the mystery guest, fresh off of an appearance on MSNBC. This is what we call scaling up. You go from a 5-minute hit on a third-rate network to an hour hit on a first-rate network. Is mystery guest Nate Persily, who we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but this is a pretty good surrogate for it. And I guess we're talking Georgia and all that jazz. Is that what you had in mind, Kate?
Yeah, I think that, Nate, we had talked about you talking about the census and redistricting, and then talking about that, and then we can talk Georgia. But then I was asking you, and you might not know, but I was asking you why there were people lined up in Brooklyn in the rain, in like two city blocks full. And when I asked them why they were there, said their answer was the Peruvian election.
Well,
and
is there a consulate? Is there a consulate there in Brooklyn?
No.
Okay. I mean, because
it's a very large event space there, which it looks like. Would you think that they were voting?
Well, Peru, like many Latin American countries, has compulsory voting, and so if they were expat Peruvians, and there was an embassy or a consulate there, that might be a place where they could vote. So that could explain. But maybe there was also a watch party or something. I mean, it's hard for me to know.
No, it's not a watch party because they're all gone now. So they're not. I don't think it's a watch. I think that it was. I think that maybe that's what it was. Maybe they opened up because of the pandemic a couple locations or something for people to kind of spread it out. That might be what it is. But yeah. Anyways, that was just bizarre. And then I was like, who would know some weird fact about an election system in a country that I have no idea what the election system is?
Well, what's happening in Peru is actually kind of interesting, where they suspect, so there is compulsory voting, and the polls show that something around 15% of voters are not going to vote for any of the candidates, and so that there's kind of a protest movement.
So how does that work? Is there a fine if you fail to vote? Is that what is the result?
No, compulsory voting is not a compulsory choice. It's compulsory.
Oh, no. Showing up.
You have to file a ballot, but you can decline to fill it out. At least in the Australian system.
Yeah.
I just didn't know. I knew that. But so that's super interesting. I knew that you didn't have to make a choice, but I was curious if there's variance in how compulsory voting is enforced.
Yeah, it's usually a fine. Sometimes it depends on the country. You can get a sort of a bad mark on your ID papers, but yeah, it's usually a fine. One of the things the studies on compulsory voting show is that you don't really have to even enforce it for have a huge effect, right? Because even a small, like in Australia, there's very little enforcement against people who don't show up to vote, but it does have a huge effect on turnout.
Yeah.
So
we can talk, if you want to talk Georgia, HR1, all that kind of stuff, happy to talk about that. Or we could talk about census and redistricting, which is, I'm kind of out of the frying pan into the fire these days with that. Or we can talk, more Facebook stuff if you want, Kate.
No, thank you.
Your show, Kate. You decide.
No, I want to talk about the census and redistricting because I honestly just have not been paying attention. Giant surprise for everyone there. I know. I'm in the midst of teaching nine credits of classes this semester, and I've just have fallen a little behind on kind of all of this stuff. I've been following the stuff in Georgia a little bit closer. But yeah, so why don't we talk about the census? What's going on? What's the lay of the land? What are people what is going on with the redistricting?
So we are in kind of uncharted territory, like we so often are these days in election law and politics, that we don't even have the apportionment numbers yet, right? Every 10 years, we would have known how many people were counted in the census for each state. We would know how many members of Congress each state would have had by now. It's going to be about another 2 weeks, I think, before we know how many people are counted in each state by the census. And we also don't know, we don't have a good grasp, though the census has leaked out some numbers on how accurate this census was. And one thing I was very worried about, because it was being taken during the pandemic, was that you're going to have a inaccurate census, particularly with what we call a differential undercount, which is, particularly Latinos, I thought would be reluctant to fill out the census form because all of what they call the census dress rehearsal was suggesting that, given the immigration and the climate and everything that Trump was doing, that there'd be a large number of Latinos who wouldn't end up filling out the census form. So that remains to be seen whether that happened. But so there's going to be several things. Like, all of this is unprecedented, has never happened before at this schedule. The first thing that's going to happen is in the next few weeks, we'll get the numbers of people per state. Once a state will, right now there are 3 lawsuits regarding the census numbers from different states, Alabama, Ohio, that have sued. And then whichever state is on the losing edge of when it comes to the census is also going to sue. Like the one state
and just to be clear, I assume what you mean by on the losing end is having lost population relative to other states, which has implications for the number of representatives that each state gets. Is that
right? It doesn't even mean that they need to have lost population. It just means they were next in line to get the next member of Congress, right? Because those last 2 states, they will be separated by a few thousand people. It always turns out that way. So then if you're the next one in line, you say, for example, as Utah did in 2000, when they said they thought they got short shrift, they first said, look, you miscounted Mormon missionaries that are living abroad. And if you counted them the right way, then Utah would have greater population than we would get the congressman that now has gone to North Carolina. Or they said, look, you've done this statistical method called hot deck imputation. This led to a Supreme Court case called Utah versus Evans. And if you didn't use that statistical method, well, then we would have gotten that member of Congress. And so there's a lot of things right now that people can, that states could argue about with this census. Now, they generally will lose because there's only so much that the courts are going to do. But if there's a kind of clear mistake that the census is committed, then there might be something that happens. But that's just on the apportionment side, right? The number of people per state. Then we have a problem, which is that, as you guys know, I draw maps for lots of different states, or have historically. By this time 10 years ago, I would have had what's known as the PL 94-171 data file, which is basically the data not just of the states, but of each neighborhood. So you would have known who lived.
It's the data file that the states use for redistricting purposes.
For redistricting, right. So every neighborhood, you would know how many people were there, what voting age, and broken down by race and ethnicity. And so you could start in the next month starting to draw maps. That data will not be available actually until September, which is, a pretty late delivery of this. So there are states like Virginia and New Jersey that ordinarily would have redrawn districts in the next month because they have elections in 2021. And they are not going to be able to do that. They're going to have to use the old lines. And so now what you're going to see is people are coming up with sort of these different statistical estimates that people are going to try to use over the next few months. But then the census will release its file. There's in one version in August, and then the final file in September. And so some of the places I'm working with, and right now I've got some cities that I'm doing redistricting for, counties. That's like too late for them constitutionally to get their lines done, right? So this is requiring just a lot of legal change around the country, and it's extremely disruptive. So that's just on the timing side, which is a real problem. Then the census has done something different this year than they have historically, which is they are deliberately inserting errors at the block level. And that's to protect privacy. So when I do redistricting, it's sort of like playing a game of Tetris where you're putting little blocks of color together and then it, eventually hits a magic number and you have a district. The way the census, because our ability to kind of use data sets and to try to figure out the identities of people has advanced so quickly in the last 10 years, that now the census is using what's known as differential privacy to inject error at the block level. This is also something, I mean, Kate, from the work I did with Facebook, that this is something that Facebook uses in order to protect the privacy when it produces some data set of its users. And so that's totally uncharted constitutional territory. Generally speaking, the standard is, the census data has to be relied upon. But now the state of Alabama is suing to try to not allow them to add this error for differential privacy. And, now to come sort of full circle to the things, Kate and I worry about on the disinformation front, you have this kind of perfect storm of, bureaucratic control over data with conspiracy theories about what is happening in the census and sort of statistical methods that most people don't understand that are going to be used to describe what's happening to the population at a time when people are very concerned about insider manipulation of politics to begin with. So that is another sort of aspect of this that remains to be seen that we'll see in late summer, early fall.
So what are, assuming that we do not have federal legislation in time to affect this process, which I think is a not certainty, but a reasonable assumption. What are the states that either had radical redistricting abuses in 10 years ago that have a reasonable process in place now, or that are ripe for abuses this time that they didn't have in 2010, and therefore that we can expect significant changes either because abuses will happen that haven't in the past, or that haven't happened in the past that have happened in the past that won't happen now.
So the 2010 elections, which were the Tea Party elections, right, where as Barack Obama said, the Democrats got shellacked, were so important because Republicans gained unified control of most of the battleground states at the time. So Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida, and then Texas. These were all states where, they had unified control and so had the sort of controlled the pen when it came to redistricting.
Right, so it can't get much worse in those states.
Right. Well, and many of those states have Democratic governors now. So Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all have Democratic governors. Michigan has moved to a kind of commission system, so that's also a little bit different than last time. North Carolina is still possible because you actually don't need the governor's signature on the redistricting. It's not a bill there. Florida is there's sort of interesting new law. It controlled the last redistricting cycle, but it didn't prevent the gerrymander there. So that Florida, you should expect litigation right out of the sort of first instance there. And then Texas always is going to get sued. And then Georgia will, Georgia's been in court, I think, for every redistricting since the Voting Rights Act was passed. That's the other thing that's different, is that we don't have Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in operation this time, because after Shelby County versus Holder, right? So you had it last time. This is the first redistricting cycle since the 1960s, which is to say the first redistricting cycle since one person, one vote, that we don't have Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act where the DOJ would be supervising what's happening in the states.
Right. Although the Voting Rights Act has some very peculiar impacts on redistricting, which are not always what one would expect, right?
To be sure, I mean, we can talk about how majority minority districts work, but the key feature here is that there's no federal body that can slow down the process like it could 10 years ago, where you could have people in the DOJ that if they saw a plan that had a discriminatory purpose or effect, that they could slow it down. Now, there's always been, since the 90s and the takeover by the Republicans of the House of Representatives, there's always been a debate about the kind of costs and benefits of drawing more majority minority districts and how that shakes down. And in fact, one of the interesting things that you've seen in the last 10 years, as you sort of think of changes in the intercensus years, is that most of the kind of civil rights pro-minority lawsuits that have come out in the last 10 years have been against packing, right? So that they've been trying to say, look, you over-concentrated African Americans and Latinos in these districts. Whereas you go back 20 years, right, 30 years when I started doing this, and it was the other way around, right? So the DOJ is forcing the construction of sometimes 65% minority districts. And now you have civil rights plaintiffs going in and saying, look, this 51% African-American district back. When I was appointed to be special master in the North Carolina case, whatever it is, 3 years ago, it was to unpack some of the districts that the court ruled were overly concentrated.
I know we have a very sophisticated audience, but because I'm, again, 9 credits of teaching and 71 L students, I will just point out to those who don't know that a special master is someone appointed by the court to be a neutral kind of decision maker that will kind of like be like between the parties that are having the conflict and kind of oversee an administrative proceeding.
And create a factual record.
Exactly, and create a factual record like a rapporteur.
Can I also say, just for viewers who don't know, packing is a term of art in this context that refers to drawing lines in the way of concentrating a large group of the voters that you don't think are going to support you into a single district. So in other words, if you're a Republican legislature and you know that 90% of the African-American community votes Democratic, and you can create a 70% African-American district, you have concentrated a very large number of voters that in other contexts may cause your people to lose elections. In a single district, they're going to elect some, Maxine Waters kind of politician, but the rest of the state is going to have many fewer African-American voters. So it's a term that refers to the concentration of voters that you do not think are going to vote for you in as few districts as possible. So you could basically, if you're going to use it in a sentence, would you say that you gerrymander district lines to create packing?
So here's when I teach.
Or is there a difference between, is gerrymandering like a separate, I didn't actually, I knew these two things, but I've actually never been precise about it, kind of used it colloquially.
So gerrymandering is the active drawing lines for political or other advantage, right? So It's just also to go back to first principles.
Named for Elbridge Gerry.
Yes, right.
I did not know that.
The third vice president of the United States.
Actually, I don't know.
Election law person. So this is great. I did not know that. Is it true then?
Yeah, named. Oh. And he drew a district in Massachusetts that looked like a salamander.
Am I able to share my screen?
Yeah.
So go above go hover your mouse above your face, and then you'll see a share screen button. And it's next to the HD button and the gear.
And by the way, a lineal descendant of Elbridge is a very fine lawyer who I believe now works for Boeing, whose name is Brett Gerry. And
this is tremendous.
Are you able to see this?
Oh, Justin Levitt. Oh.
Well, this is a very famous, picture.
I've seen. I've seen that.
So this was the original. This was literally the where the word gerrymander came from, which is that there was a journalist who was looking at the map of, actually you would be familiar with this area in northern Massachusetts, Kate.
Yeah.
Where the Senate map for Massachusetts had these different districts here, and this red district was seen as there was one journalist at a local paper who looked at it and said, "Hey, that looks like a salamander," and the guy next to him said, "No, it looks like a gerrymander." And so they drew this political cartoon of all the towns in northern Massachusetts.
I never learned that. Oh my God. I'm like, you're blowing my mind. Now I need to I should just audit your election law course.
I thought about putting up some videos on this. There's got to be just to.
I think you should do some lawfare lectures on this.
That would be fun. Yeah,
that would be so fun.
Check out the one we did with Paul Rosenzweig.
Stupid law student.
Check out the one we did with Paul Rosenzweig the other day on cybersecurity metrics. We should do history of election law.
Well, it's like the Section 230 series I did, and with the Yale ISP, and then do you know how many people I talk to, like reporters, or like I've watched that entire series on Lawfare before they call me. I'm like, thank God, this is so much better than you not having watched that and calling me. Sorry. Anyways, this is great.
So anyway, if you look at, so this was the way that they were packing and cracking the anti-federalists in Massachusetts. But you go, so if you look at the famous cases in dealing with racial gerrymandering, Gamillion versus Lightfoot, the famous case out of Tuskegee, where they took what was a square city and then turned it into this yellow figure to excise all the African Americans from Tuskegee, right?
No, so this graphic I've seen. I'm familiar with this. I didn't know that the gerrymander, that's where the origins. I really just didn't know that.
And so the strategies, right, for gerrymandering are packing, cracking, stacking, and kidnapping. So as Ben said, right, you can pack your opponents into as few districts as possible, or you could spread them among as many as possible. So here are the districts in 1966 in Mississippi, the proposed districts, where what they did, instead of drawing a majority African-American district along the Delta, right, they drew these 5 districts, each with this one 34% black, this one 44%, 44, 20, 39, in order to dilute the impact of African-American voting. Now, the one I'll just say, just so I can have this up there. So that when I was appointed to do the Georgia redistricting in 2003 or so, one of the real challenges is that because of residential segregation, sometimes it's really hard not to pack, right? If you draw inside Atlanta, districts like this, these will be 90% African-American districts.
Yeah.
If you draw districts on the outside like this, right, they'll be about 30% African-American. And depending on which whites you're putting in with African-Americans, you're going to end up, some of these are
Republican or Democrat
areas, right? There are places, if Buckhead and those areas, which are much more liberal, not as big a deal. And so there is always this kind of Goldilocks question in redistricting about sort of how much packing, how much cracking one allows. And I'll just say just one last thing on this, which is the famous districts from Shaw versus Reno, the cases that dealt with majority minority districts, these sort of strangely shaped districts from Georgia, Florida, Louisiana. Here are the ones from Texas.
Why do you have ugly on there? You're just making the point that they're not very plausibly.
When I teach this, there's a question about whether compactness a lack of compactness is constitutionally suspect. Because here's what Justice O'Connor says in Shaw versus Reno. She says, look, we believe that reapportionment is one area in which appearances do matter. A reapportionment plan that includes in one district individuals who belong to the same race, but who are otherwise widely separated by geographical and political boundaries, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to political apartheid.
I remember that district well. That's the one that followed the highway for 150 miles, and it's half a mile on either side of the highway.
So just to give a slight moment of context, is I teach redlining. And I'm teaching the exclusionary zoning this week, right? And so this is just kind of So what is to say is like, I know that all of these ideas exist, but I actually didn't know the mechanics of them for electoral politics the way I know them for housing and other types of things. But they do line up. There is a lot of overlap.
Well, that's why. So like Gamillion, it's a little bit different, right? They were literally excising African Americans from the city. Here, you've got the over-concentration, right? And as Ben was saying before, pursuant to DOJ enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, those strange districts were drawn. And that one went down, the Shaw district went down I-85. And so then the question is, well, the Supreme Court then says that is presumptively unconstitutional, right? And then there's an interest. Now, well, I can tell you that line that I read from Justice O'Connor about it bearing resemblance to political apartheid. You can imagine how NAACP-LDF felt about that, because at the time, and I was, involved in the late 90s, early 2000s with some of this, and it's like, these were districts. Remember, some of these districts facilitated the first election of African Americans in many of these states, right? Because you had white Democrats who, because of incumbency advantages up through the 1990s, were able to continue to win. And so a lot of them ended up losing. You ended up with more African American Latino districts, but there are political consequences to that as well. And many of those Dixiecrats would have lost or converted parties anyway at some point over the 90s and 2000s. But that line of cases has always had at the time been seen as kind of anti-civil rights kind of cases. Now they're being used, as I was mentioning before, by civil rights plaintiffs to come in and say, look, you are over-concentrating African Americans in particular districts and to the detriment of African Americans. And so you need to spread out the population a bit more.
So to go back to my original question, what are the states where you're expecting things to look better than 10 years ago? And what are the states, either because there are commissions now a la Michigan, or that there's more political diversity, and therefore one party doesn't have the, all of the power to impose his will? And what are the states, like I imagine Virginia must be one, where you've gone from essentially all Republican control to all Democrat control. I imagine you're going to have a bunch of Virginia Republicans redistricted out of seats.
They've gone in the direction of a commission now.
I see.
So it may be, I can't remember the specifics as to how much power the commission has there, but at least in the first instance, there's going to be something that resembles a nonpartisan map. I think that there's the possibility that the governor and the legislature can overturn it, but I'm not sure. That's also true in New York, where New York, I was involved in the New York redistricting. I was appointed 10 years ago to do that. And
you're the one that stole Louise Slaughter from me. I think you might have been. No, I'm sorry. I think.
Well. That's a really interesting. I actually have the map. I have it up in my office here. The original one. But Louise Slaughter's district before that contained part of Rochester, part of northern Buffalo, and then had a thin line that went up through Niagara Falls and all the way through northwestern New York. It was one of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. And so then after the court plan that I was involved in, then she basically had a Rochester-based district, and so
it was.
But all right. So going back to the states, Ben, you've got. So one thing we should also say is the Democrats do this too. They just don't have control as often as the Republicans have. So Illinois,
for those of us who know Maryland politics, it is, gerrymandering is not the sole province of Republicans. It is the province of parties in power.
And so Illinois and Maryland were the Democratic gerrymanders last time. And the Maryland case actually went to the Supreme Court alongside the others that were in the Rucho case that the Supreme Court decided wasn't going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering. So, and Maryland also is establishing a commission. Again, I think it's advisory, but the governor has it. And so we'll see what comes out of that.
But also, Maryland has divided politics now. It has a Republican governor, so it has a solidly Democratic legislature. You're going to have a reasonable process in Maryland.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I assume so. I mean, there's always the possibility of overturning or whatever, but I don't know overturning a veto. But I think that's right. Because Maryland had some really crazy districts last time, the ones that just went from the east. And so on the Republican side, Michigan is going to be so Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania should probably be less likely to have partisan gerrymanders than they did 10 years ago. I was involved in the Pennsylvania case, the most recent one, where I was appointed, and that obviously very politically controversial. And so the existing districts are 9 Democrat, 9 Republican there, and we'll see what the legislature tries to do, and that may lead to the courts getting involved there. But I would keep my eye on, in terms of areas where Republicans can make gains through gerrymandering. You've got the possibility of Ohio. Ohio also is going to have a legislative commission, I believe, for the state legislature. Then you've got Florida, where they've got some strict constitutional requirements, but Florida is going to gain like 2 or 3 states. Texas, 2 or 3 districts. Texas is going to gain, I think, 3 or more districts. So that's the area where you'll see it. Georgia will gain, I think, at least 1. And North Carolina will probably gain 1. And so those are the states that I would be looking at. And then the ones where, in the Northeast and Midwest, which are going to lose districts, because the question is who's going to be on the chopping block.
So I have to take this to a slightly jokier, not that this has not been educational, but like, how you could you go to carnivals and there'll be that guy that like looks at you and guesses your weight, and if you gets wrong, they'll is this if you're on a plane next to a stranger and they tell you that they're from from a county in a certain place, right, can you tell them their entire districting history and everything about them?
So this provokes a story that I don't think I've ever told publicly that you're going to love. So, and it involves some interesting characters in the redistricting lore. You may have heard of Tom Hoffler, who was the guy in North Carolina who died, and his hard drives he was the Republican redistricting consultant there.
Yeah. And his daughter turns them over to the ACLU in a fabulous act of familial betrayal. It's you're a
straight up Mary Trump shit.
Yeah, Republican redistricting consultant.
There's litigation that's
bad relationship with your daughter, and she's like, how can I get revenge on Dad for all those years? And she says, I know, I'm going to give his hard drive to the ACLU.
Yeah. Oh, and this is a story for the listeners. I mean, it's really an incredibly dramatic, almost thriller kind of story, what's happened here. But so I was at a National Conference of State Legislatures meeting with Tom Hoffler, Ben Ginsburg, and several others, gave some talks there.
I love Ben.
What'd you say?
Sorry. I like Ben. That already, though. No, sorry,
And they had the Republican redistricting map. So it was the RNC redistricting map they were giving out to Republicans there. And I said to Tom Hoffler, I'm like, can I please have one of these cool maps that look like some of the stuff behind me? He's like, no. I was like, please, I won't share it with anyone. He said, fine. So I took the Republican redistricting map for the country, and I'm on a plane going back to, I was teaching at Columbia at the time. I'm on a plane back to Columbia, and who do I see on my plane but Mitch McConnell? Okay. And I'm like, oh, I have got to go up to him.
By the way, I have gotten on a lot of planes over the years. Mitch McConnell, never been on one of them.
Well, Mitch McConnell was sitting back in coach, where I was. And I said, Senator McConnell, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to autograph my Republican redistricting map. I said, will you please sign right above the elephant right here? And so I have an autographed Republican redistricting map from Mitch McConnell from that time. So
that is awesome. That was drawn by Hoffler.
Yeah, right. It was. That's
that is a really unique piece of election
nerd lore, but that's
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Oh my gosh, that reminds me. Well, I told the story already, but my dad has, the 1986 Game 6 of the 1986 World Series where the Red Sox lost to the Mets and Bill Buckner went under his legs. My dad is a huge Red Sox fan. It was like a tragic day for him. Anyways, he ended up getting Bill Buckner's signature on a ball when he came through to kind of do a signing, and then I had gotten Bob Stanley's signature as a pitcher. Signature on a ball when I was at Brown because he came and did an event at Brown. And so then I'd given it to my dad for Christmas. My dad got it signed by Buckner and then decided he was going to get it signed by every single person who had touched the ball as like Mookie Wilson and like everything else. Wow. Like went through. And so he has every single person on the ball. And the only other ball my dad has is all three DiMaggio brothers on one ball. Yeah. It's
that's
cool.
Worth something.
Yeah, I know. It's like, well, I mean, two of them sucked, but one of them was really good. You might have heard of them. Like, I know. But yeah, no, I've made careful plans. I was like, so Mom and Dad, you're putting the ball in a trust, right? For Alex and I to argue over. Like, I know. Hi, Daniel.
Daniel just materialized on screen with a question.
Great.
So I guess I'm going to switch the subject to the Georgia election law, and I'm wondering which provisos of the Georgia election law do you think are most vulnerable to successful legal challenge given the composition of today's courts?
So I actually think that this U.S. Supreme Court would uphold the Georgia law. The hard part is, if the Georgia law is struck down, it'll be struck down because of racially discriminatory purpose and racially discriminatory impact under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so the provisions that would be vulnerable would be maybe the ban on drop boxes, or not the ban, the regulation of drop boxes, the rules with respect to absentee voting and the like. Here's the problem, which is that for every subsection of the Georgia law, there is another state that has that provision as well. So you take something like the addition of voter ID, like for absentee balloting, that you have to put your social security number, last 4 digits social security number, your driver's license number. That's what Minnesota does. And Minnesota is not seen as like this incredibly vote suppressive state. Now, and so in order to get at this, right, you have to say, well, it's going to have a discriminatory effect in Georgia, or it's got a discriminatory purpose. One thing to keep an eye on is the case out of Arizona that the Supreme Court is deciding this term, the Brnovich case, which is a Section 2 Voting Rights Act case.
Did you sign an amici in that?
I did not. No.
Okay.
I try, because I get appointed by the courts in these things. I try to, at least on the Voting Rights Act stuff. I mean, I did in the Shelby County case and the earlier ones, but for the upcoming cycle, I'm going to try to stay out of litigation. But if you look at that Section 2 case that's going up to Supreme Court, we will get a sense from the Supreme Court in the next few months how they would receive something like the Georgia law.
So I have a question about the Georgia law, which is, the law is clearly badly intended, right? It's a response to voter turnout. The legislature is shocked to discover that, people are voting apropos of the rules that it's set up to deal with COVID, and also just absentee ballot, a generally pretty liberal voting regime with respect to absentee ballot rules. That said, the most objectionable provisions of the law were removed, and it's not clear to me what the reasonable expectations of the law as passed going into effect would be on voter turnout. I'm curious for your kind of gestalt assessment of that. Is this a situation where the bark was worse than the bite, and the bite puts Georgia kind of in the median pack nationwide about things like, they're still pretty actually progressive on things like early voting relative to a bunch of other states? Or is this a situation in which they've cleverly made the thing seem a lot less radical than the effect would actually be, and this is a surgical scalpel strike against African American voting? How do you understand it at the end of the day?
So you may have seen earlier this week that Nate Cohn had a piece on this about the Georgia law and how it would affect turnout, and he was savaged on Twitter as a result. Let me say this, which is that it is very difficult at the front end to assess whether any of these individual interventions are going to have an impact on turnout in general or on African American turnout in particular. So that's the first thing to say. Second is to repeat what you said, which is that they are all built on addressing the big lie, which is that they are all motivated by addressing fraud that did not happen in Georgia. And it's even the governor who now signed the law who was the one who said that there was no fraud in the 2020 election. And so one of the reasons you might have an easier time maybe proving discriminatory purpose here is that there really is no good reason to pass these restrictions, because the mail ballots were actually, all ballots in Georgia were counted 3 times, right, in this last election. And so there's
but you're not going to get, but as you point out, the current court's going to look at this, and it is going to accept as a non-discriminatory purpose that there were many people who believed that the election was corrupted, and the Georgia legislature was responding to the perception of a lack of election security in a kind of prophylactic way. And so the relevant record is not the record of actual fraud. It's the record of people believing there was a problem.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the court buys that, don't you?
Well, Justice Thomas, in fact, wrote that down, right? It literally said that in a kind of dissent from the denial of cert or the mooting of a case out of Pennsylvania, where he basically said, there's a lack of confidence here that's caused by these different changes. So yes, that is true. That there's no evidence, by the way, and I've done some studies on this, there's no evidence that any of these measures will actually change people's perceptions of the electoral system. It's not like they will become more confident. So, for example, states with voter ID laws don't have populations that are more confident in the election infrastructure than states that don't have voter ID laws. Remember, this is pretty insider baseball kind of stuff in terms of the technicalities on this. But just to go to the crux of the issue that you were suggesting, I don't think this law will have much of an effect on a presidential election, because when people are motivated to vote and when there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of money and mobilization, I think that you will have people who will figure out a way to vote, whether it's early in person, absentee, or something else. I am worried about the midterms and off-year elections.
I was just going to say that. That seems much more the concern.
If you're deciding, should I go, to get my absentee ballot or should I not, right? The marginal voters might be like, it's just like the burdens exceed the benefits here. In addition, the most significant thing, and why I see the Georgia law more as a kind of like loaded gun waiting to go off as opposed to one that's already been fired, is that the way they are reshuffling authority between the counties and the state government, and how the legislature now has taken away the role that the Secretary of State played in the election and the election board and replaced it with someone that the legislature appoints, suggests to me that in a close election like the one we just had, where there's a fight between Fulton County in particular and Georgia government on the other, that at the state level that they could put a thumb on the scales. And that, by the way, that fight between the states and the more liberal cities we're seeing around the country. So Texas now has a series of bills that, as far as I can tell, are really just targeting Houston and Harris County, because Harris County did all kinds of interesting things in this last election. They had lots more ballot drop boxes that they tried to put out. They had drive-through voting. They had 24-hour voting, right, that they tried to do. All of these are now in the new Texas bill, subject to restriction at the state level. So you see this kind of attempt by the states to clamp down on what are largely minority, largely Democratic cities.
Mary, you are a black rectangle, but your mic is on and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much for this show. I'm in a late time zone, so I'm not really in daytime appearance. My question: Ellie Honig is just starting to promote his book about Bill Barr. Is it jaw-dropping that a prosecutor has to expose the harms done to the rule of law by the former AG in print, rather than having Barr be pursued by legal process? Is Barr in any legal jeopardy, or has he kept his hands clean?
So this is a very interesting. So I would just say it's not an election law question.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Don't
don't worry about it, Nate.
If Nate or Kate has thoughts on it, they're welcome to jump in. But I'll just say, I will be interested to see what Ellie alleges about Barr. But I think most of what Barr did is not remotely in the land of the legally actionable. It's in the land of the gross improper management of the Justice Department and what I would call abuse of prosecutorial discretion. But these are not, by the way, mostly abuse of prosecutorial discretion on the side of leniency toward favored defendants. For example, dropping cases against, Mike Flynn that you would never drop against a normal criminal defendant, right? Filing a sentencing brief in Roger Stone the Roger Stone case that departs from all of the normal Justice Department behaviors. These are terrible things for the leader of the Justice Department to do. They are in no sense that I'm aware of criminal or, sort of misconduct as we normally understand it. Rather, they're things that we think of as violative of the norms of the department and the expected behavior of the Attorney General. So I mean, Ellie is a serious guy, and I will be I haven't read his book, and I'll be very curious to read what his suggestion is that Barr sort of did something actionably wrong rather than just kind of wrong. But I think the judgment of Bill Barr is going to be in history. I think he's going to go down, and I say this as somebody who was encouraged by his nomination, and we were never close or anything, but I always thought highly of him as a person, and he's a very smart guy, and I think the judgment of him will be as one of the worst attorney generals of this, the worst attorney general of this period of history. You have to go back. You really have to go back to John Mitchell and people who really were criminals before you have anybody who had a bigger negative impact on the Justice Department than Bill Barr. But I don't see it I see it as the sort of thing you deal with through criticism of the sort, like writing a book is a good way to do it, rather than through action on legal action of one sort or another.
I have a question. What is Alberto Gonzalez doing these days? Do you know?
Alberto Gonzalez, who
does he have a LinkedIn page that I can look at?
So he was associated with a university in Texas for a while.
SMU or something. Yeah, I can't remember which one.
Rights or something? Okay, so he went in. Okay.
And he's
I didn't know if he went to be a partner at a firm or something.
No, I think he may have had a sort of an of-counsel relationship with one firm or another. But look, Alberto Gonzalez is up there among the lousy attorney generals.
Right, I just didn't want to leave him out. So.
He's not in Bill Barr's league.
No. I know. And
Barr is.
Do you think there'll be any prosecutions? Leave aside what happened on January 6th. but any prosecutions of anyone in the Trump administration by this Justice Department. I get asked this question sometimes, and I think that basically just knowing who Merrick Garland and Joe Biden are, that there's just this incredible impulse to move on, and that there really isn't likelihood to see additional any prosecutions, though one could have imagined a situation where there would have been.
So first of all, I think that I would hope that Biden's involvement in this question was limited to the choice of Merrick Garland.
Yeah.
That is, if you're Joe Biden and you want a wise, prudent individual making the decisions and you don't want to be involved in the decisions yourself, as he shouldn't be, you call up Merrick Garland and you say, hey, would you come off the bench, and you ask him to do it. And then you got to leave the decisions to him. I agree with you that Merrick Garland is somebody who will have a vibrant sense of the downsides of bringing cases that other people will be enthusiastic about. That said, I do think there are some cases that bubble up through the system that when the facts are all in, they're just appalling. And the Matt Gaetz situation is like, he's not a Trump administration official exactly, but there is okay, but what about if they're transporting 17-year-olds over state lines for immoral purposes, right? And that wasn't one that we thought we were going to be dealing with. I also think that there are residual cases from the Southern District that they're going to have to decide how to think about. And I don't know how any of it shakes out at the end of the day. I do agree with you that there's no way the Justice Department brings a case against senior Trump administration officials without a good, long discussion in the Attorney General's conference room about the consequences of, prosecuting your political predecessors. And by the way, I think that's great. I think we should have that conversation before we go after any of these motherfuckers who I would otherwise love to see gone after, right? Like, I think it's good that vindictive people like me are not the ones who are making the decisions.
Well, I think you're right that seeing what's going to happen in New York, also seeing what happens in Georgia, seeing what happens with the Trump, the money issues, whether it's a hotel or otherwise, that I'm actually somewhat surprised we haven't seen more out of New York by this point. I thought we would have seen a little more, but that's just on the president.
Out of Albany or out of Albany? Like when you say,
Well, I am the local. You've got the foundation issues. You've got the other commercial issues, and we'll see what happens.
I think if Trump personally has a problem from a criminal law perspective, I would think the Manhattan DA is his biggest problem right now, and also the Fulton County DA, who actually seems like a pretty serious woman, and who's got tapes. So I think he's got state law problems that, frankly, are in areas I don't know anything about. But do I think it's likely that the Justice Department is going to prosecute him? No. Do I think it is impossible that the Justice Department surprised everybody by filing a case against Steve Bannon for grifting, and there could be 10 of those
Surprised
cases involving a bunch of people. So I don't want to say it's not going to happen but I don't think I wouldn't put even money on it either. Eric Berg, joining from Idaho. The floor is yours, even though you are still invisible. There you are.
I'm visible now.
You're visible.
Yeah. So why is the narrative on Georgia focused on, giving water in lines and the hours of elections and everything else? and not, to be frank, the election stealing parts of removing the Secretary of States from the board, making it so the legislator can uh, take control from the counties. I'm out in county politics in Idaho, and I can tell you that is the part I would be concerned of has happened in my county.
Yeah, and I think your impulse is the right one, which is that's what we need to focus on there, as well as in some of these other states. I think the story about water and food to voters in line is just such a easy soundbite that has been able to tag that law to just show its irrationality and cruelty. And so people have focused on that, even though there are other states that have rules like that. And it's not so clear that in particular is going to have a problem, cause particular problems for voters. I will say that the more difficult that the state of Georgia makes it to cast an absentee ballot, the more voters are then going to shift to the other voting options, whether it's early voting or polling place voting. And so Fulton County in particular has a history with these long lines. And so, it is true that people are going to be willing to wait for hours on end, but part of what these laws are doing are just making it a little more cumbersome, a little more punishing, a little more difficult to engage in the kind of polling place voting that they historically would want to see. But yes, I do think this reorganization of authority, the reason that people don't focus on it as much is because it's not as clear what its impact is going to be. It's only going to be when they push the button, right, to sort of take authority away from the local counties that we'll see the impact of it.
Richard Wattenbarger, you get the last question this evening, and I just want to point out that Kate has now retaliated to our Bruckner fight by having a Bill Buckner story every day. So it's just one, just drop the R and you go from our mania to Kate's mania.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
My God, will you shut up about Bruckner?
All right. So I have my question is really about future legislation and pertaining to gerrymandering and the drawing of districts. I know that we have the mathematics now to describe a district that's going to be representative, but not in a wacky sort of shape. And I'm wondering first of all, how foolproof, if that were to be written, first of all, could that be written into legislation? And if it were, how foolproof would it be? In other words, how much luck how many lawsuits over the calculation would be forestalled by that? And also, I guess hanging off of that, is that something that would have to be passed at the state level, or could that would actually be constitutional to have federal legislation to that effect?
So right now, HR 1 or S1, the federal legislation dealing with voting has gerrymandering provisions in it, forcing the establishment of commissions, but then also criteria about compactness, political subdivision lines, and the like. So there are some states that do have some kinds of quasi-mathematical restrictions. One of the things you realize when you get involved in this is that the focus on shapes is actually a little bit of a distraction that we tend to, this is sort of like what we were talking about before with the sound bites, which is that, everybody looks at the shapes and they figure out if it looks strange, well, then there's something nefarious that's going on.
Right.
But that with square districts, you can gerrymander. In fact, Republicans in particular are able to gerrymander with square districts because of the over-concentration and natural segregation of Democrats in cities. And so there's only so much one can do through, say, mathematical restrictions on describing compactness and the like. And when I'm a special master or something, I put in all of those measures, and there's a whole series of measures like comparing the shape of a district to a circle or a square or something like that. And so there's compactness is a value in redistricting, but it's one value among many, and we need to make sure that those other values of like avoiding partisan bias and having competition and respecting communities of interest are in there as well.
Yeah.
And so and the legislation is there's state legislation that's regulated this, and then the federal legislation is also a possibility.
So I guess there are strange shapes, though, are smelly, aren't they? You know, you see a strange shape and you think, that doesn't pass the smell test.
Although I will say, in defense of strange shapes, sometimes strange shapes result from because certain areas are much more population dense than others, and if districts have to be the same size in population, they're going to be radically different sizes in geographic shape.
Yeah, I guess I'm just referring to when the alarm bells go off. Like, oh, we should really take a look at this. This looks strange. Is this okay?
Right. Well, I think that's O'Connor. That's O'Connor's kind of ugliness, kind of like signaling, right? Like it's like that if there's this weird serpent shape. But to your point, Nate, I think that that's exactly right. That there's not like a consistent. Like that like you can manage to gerrymander just fine if you slice things into slivers or into certain size squares or like whatever else, or like to control where the line is. I'm just thinking of like 8 Mile Road in Detroit. Like you could have a nice straight line that's perfectly discriminatory, like that is right along 8 Mile Road. So like, I mean, so that I teach that for housing purposes, but like you could you could teach the same thing for gerrymandering.
Yes, and I'll say, when I first did New York, for example, we did one of the districts followed a subway route, because you might think that, subways in New York, subway lines are kind of good definition of communities in ways that, suppose if you join the Upper East Side and Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is always a proposal that's on the table, right? There's huge numbers of people who protest because they're like, we're completely different than those people over there, right? And I remember having a hearing where someone came in and said, and so the Upper West Side district historically went all the way, what Jerry Nadler used to call the Nathans to Zabars district, right? It would go all the way.
I love that. I never heard that.
And Charlie Rangel's district was
Charlie Rangel.
Charlie Rangel's district was all over the place.
Where does this voice come from? And why is it episode 380 and you're just showing us your Charlie Rangel?
I can do Charlie Rangel and I can do Strom Thurmond, and those are the only two I can do.
You can keep the Strom Thurmond. You can just keep that.
I can't put Strom Thurmond and Charlie Rangel next to each other. There was a time when I could do all right after the Anita Hill hearings, I could do reasonably well all of the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Oh my goodness!
That's a good party trick. That would
I could do
parties.
I could do the questions that Howell Heflin asked Anita Hill for a while.
Oh my god! Oh my god! That's a great point though, Nate. It's like one of the things, of course, that I love about New York is that like you can go from the Upper East Side to like Chinatown on the same line, and like it's just like into like the Lower East Side and to the East Village and Union Square, and then like all the way up to like Spanish Harlem, like all on one line, and like, wow, is that are those some different neighborhoods? And so and so like there's
they're different. So contra that, when I was appointed to Georgia, drew a district in northern Georgia that was a perfect square. It looked like, Montana or something. And there was a mountain range that went right down the middle of the district. So the only way you could get from one side of the district to the other is if you went outside the district, right? And so shapes are descriptive of something, but they just don't they don't by themselves suggest a kind of redistricting principle that has philosophical legitimacy.
Well, it's like, I don't know. It's like a very architectural, it kind of reminds me of in the tech space, like the Larry Lessig kind of arguments about the four constraints on an individual, like market law norms and like architecture but architecture is like a huge way of how we draw lines, because like it turns out rivers are hard to cross, mountain ranges are hard to cross, but also if you have some huge top-down land grab process that you like institute federally, you're going to get square districts. So like it's I don't know. Anyways, we have to wrap. It is this has been amazing. I've learned a ton. I'm not joking about sitting in on your, I'd probably make you nervous or something, but maybe but like if you did something for Lawfare, I would watch those times 20. Like, I want to hear everything about what you have in all of those slides. So thank you so much for coming on and being my mystery guest today.
Sure.
Great to see you, Nate. And
My
seriously,
pleasure.
let's talk about doing some
Sure.
law.
No, I've been thinking about doing something on the redistricting front, almost like a MOOC kind of thing, just to teach people a little bit about what they're about to confront, because there's going to be a lot of coverage and also disinformation and acrimony come the fall.
Well, like Section 230, it ends up becoming this incredibly misunderstood political question. And some of it is politics, but some of it is really not politics. And separating out like what is from what isn't is really important. And you have a great perch to be doing that from. And like, you have the voice to kind of make that.
Well, just as a prelude to that, I will do this year what I did 10 years ago, which is I'm going to teach my students how to redistrict, and we're going to put up the maps at drawcongress.org. It's right now that website's not active, but also if there are people who want to draw maps that, there are a lot of public interest websites that now facilitate that.
There are some actually, like, sorry, I will actually maybe put you in touch with some really like kind of niche and weird internet groups that are into cartography and modern cartography.
Yeah.
I would love to help you do that. That would be great. We will be back 23 hour, right? 23, right? 23.
Well, it's 20, actually, no, 20, because we're coming at 6 o'clock tomorrow.
20. Oh, you're right. 24 out.
No, it's actually 23 because it's usually 22.
Oh, I didn't.
So you were right. You were just right for the wrong
but
reason.
Accidentally, you were on to me, Ben. My bad math. I'm so tired. I got no sleep last night. 23 hours and 53 minutes from now. And just for people who are interested, just as like a kind of dorky plug, I am hosting a talk. I will be moderating it'll just be a Q&A one-on-one with my former Second Circuit judge, Richard Wesley, with part of the St. John's and the the New York City Historical Society, that is going to be talking about technology in the courts and how technology has changed the courts. And that will be at 7:30. So 30 minutes after In Lieu of Fun. I will post about it in my Twitter page. If you want any, I can't believe I said Twitter page. That makes me sound like I'm like 43.
Can I just point out that if you were 43, you would still be 8 years younger than I am?
I know.
So, what a hardship that would be.
I have to take my wins where I can get them.
And next time I'm on, I will tell the story, not the McConnell story, but the time I was actually with Charlie Rangel in a Donald Trump hotel. But I will leave that hanging for next time.
I'm excited about that. I want to hear that story. But I will tell the story tomorrow of the time in 1994 at Janet Reno's Christmas party when I saw Strom Thurmond confront Eric Holder, who was then the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia.
Really?
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds like we'll have you on soon, Nate, because I want to hear both of those stories.
Good to see you all.
We will see you tomorrow. And remember, until then, we don't have fun anymore, but you guys are saddled with both my fight with Richard over Bruckner and Kate's serial telling of the Bill Buckner.
I told it twice.
Yeah. Well, I want to say you won with 83%, 84% of the vote found the Bruckner more tedious than Bill Buckner. And I want to say I agree. That's because I hate Anton Bruckner. It is more tedious. You're all right in the audience. If you voted for Bill Buckner, you're wrong.